Hey, how's it going? My name is Thomas Oakleberry. I'm giving a presentation on the book I read for class, which is Marketing Death. It is about by Sharish Shun Qingqian, and it is about marketing life insurance in China. And so, what makes marketing life insurance so difficult in China, and what is brought up about this book in this book all the time, is there's a huge cultural taboo about talking about death, and especially like early death or any sort of misfortune. And so the book asks, how does the life insurance developed market despite this intense cultural barrier? And so it asks some informants about like death, and she asks about something bad happening, and the Chinese reply was that they don't think about bad things, but that they think about good things. So Chinese culture is just filled with an evasive attitude towards thinking about death, and the book goes into it more and talks about how just Chinese philosophy doesn't really talk about it much. It's not mentioned much, and it's just a cultural thing that these companies have to get around. And so how the companies get around this cultural barrier to create markets is using culture as a toolkit, and that's something I thought was a cool concept introduced, because it shows the practicality of not only this book but this class in general. And so she talks about like economic actors using culture as a toolkit and just as a means of creating markets and creating perceptions. And the book takes place in Shanghai, which is one of the most, it talks about it being like a pioneer of Western concepts, and so that goes into it as well. So the book talks about a lot about the conditions leading up, the conditions that add to the cultural context of the 1990s, which is when life insurance is reintroduced. So the two big periods of life insurance in China can be divided between the pre-1449 period and the post-49 period, and that is when the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, came into power. So before the CCP, the insurance that was sold was British and just foreign companies. The Chinese people traditionally had insurance, but it was in the form of savings and in kin relationships with the Ganqi and Requing, if I'm saying that right, but we'll get back into that later. So before the CCP, insurance is really only sold by the foreign companies, and then post CCP, that changes. All the foreign investors are outed by 1952, and the life insurance, or the reappearance of insurance, doesn't really happen until the late 70s. And so the conditions under the CCP actually made it so that the modern government would reaccept it in the 90s, because due to the one-child policy, eroding kinship, and urbanization, this all affects the kinship networks that were the traditional insurance of China, with and eroding state provision on welfare. So the urbanization kind of leads to this breakdown of the kinship networks, and the government kind of comes in that role to provide people from cradle to grave, I think it said. And so with the rise of the Chinese economics in the 1990s, a new middle class is popping up with more disposable income, and the government allows life insurance or insurance to start being sold again, because they have this policy of, I think it was said, a black cat or a white cat, it does not matter as long as the cat catches mice. And it was just this shift from ideological economics to just practical. And so with this and with all these loss of kinship networks, the government needed to respond from this shift from community to society. And so, yeah, the answer was to outsource this to life insurance companies. So, yeah, the birth of a consumer society leads to this. And so the book also talks about cultural elements that are congenial to life insurance and an obstacle. So the congenial ones are the practical economies over the ideological, and ownership starts to become a status symbol. And there's a craving for all these new foreign commodities and things like that, and just this idea of modernity that is tied to capitalism. And so the family and child-centered ethos of China really helps life insurance, because family is important to them despite the Maoist state and the erosion of these kinship networks. And yeah, the cultural obstacles have been stated, just the concepts of life and death. And to them, death is an unknown. It's the end. And it's just not talking about it makes it more mystical. And so what is important to look at here is there's ancestor worship in China. This can only be done from juniors to seniors. And so dying before a parent means no proper worship. So there's a different conception of life and death. And there's an idea of a good life where people, they live their whole life and they start poorer and end their life richer. And that is a good life. Compared to, and this contrasts with the Western view of a responsible death is dying by having their affairs in order and all this. This just concept isn't familiar to Chinese people. Yeah, because of this relationship between living ancestors, or between the living and ancestors. The living provide resources to the ancestors and not the other way around. So getting into this, there's the conflict of defining life insurance between the AIA and Ping An. And so AIA is the American foreign firm, and Ping An is the largest domestic firm. So AIA is all about they market life insurance as risk management, and they believe they're doing insurance the right way. And so Ping An is more about market share, and they're domestic and localized, and they just adapt to context very well. So basically, AIM's strategy is quality over quantity, and Ping An is more quantity over quality, because they sell these plans, but they're not always financially beneficial to them. They're more about just getting as much of the market as they can. So the next chapter gets into manufacturing sales forces. So, talks about the Thai firm, or no, sorry, the Chinese firm Ping An, the American firm AIA, the Thai firm PA, and the German firm AD, and just how they create their sales force, and they have quite different strategies. So AIA is organized, it's systemic, it's formal. They're attempting to move towards locality. Then the Chinese PA is consul, local, it's non-Western, and they are wanting to look more modern. PA, the Thai firm, it's group based, it's supportive, energetic, and upbeat. The German AD one is individual, optimized, and these people are there for a job, not to sell life insurance, but just to make money. So this gets into more specifically, and it talks about AIA as a proud big brother, and they're the oldest in the pre-1949 out of all the companies, so they're kind of seen as the prototype, and they sell insurance the traditional way. They still localize, but not to the extent. They don't want to cave, I guess you could say. They believe in doing insurance this right way, with this risk management approach compared to Ping An's money management approach. So their sales agents are professional, and they try to make them look like they're professional missionary type people doing this job out of altruism. And they train them extensively on risk management, on how to act, on how to dress. They're given like trips and like bonuses and stuff, and things that associate them with AIA. So it's also a status thing to work at this place. And so Ping An is described in the book as an authoritative parent, and they're very Chinese, and they're proactive with the foreign model and want to remain modern, but still remain very Chinese. And these Chinese characteristics are centralized in a paternalistic operation. Division of labor among organized units is unclear and underdeveloped. And so the way Ping An goes about is the most effective strategy, because they utilize the Guanxi and the Ring Qing, which we'll get to later. So let's get to the Pacific Aetna as a warm family. This is the Thai firm, and they have like a family atmosphere of belonging and loyalty. The higher ups come down and hang out with the local people, the commoners, and the sales agents are seen as a family member, and everyone's their own boss. And they have a reward oriented approach, and they're encouraged to recruit and work as a collective. They're rewarding for getting new hires, and they have group awards, and they're just more fun. Like their benefits include like tickets to concerts, things like that. So the German AD is contrasts with the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese are considered the best by the author at utilizing the culture and able to shape this market, and the German firm is the worst. So they have no prior experience in China, no business, not even just insurance, but no business in China at all. So the way they run it is it's very individualistic. Employees are just kind of held accountable. They're supposed to be independent and proactive. And this organization is just completely foreign to the local salesmen, and it just did not work. They tried to sell these agents as elites and commoners. There was friction between the in-house staff and the sales agents, and it just did not translate as well. This did the worst out of the four groups. and the sales agents had poor morale and were dissatisfied in their jobs. So this chapter just talks all about how cultural capital, which she calls it, just your cultural repertoire, shapes management strategy, and how that can translate and how that cannot translate in other countries. So the Making Transactions chapter talks about how to introduce a new market or a market to a new population. And it talks about how trust needs to be cultivated and a need for the commodity. And so we'll get into the two differing approaches to this is the AIA and the Ping An. And so the AIA model is just very professionalized, it's very standardized. They're given scripts and they're giving extensive training on this RM model. They're supposed to try and raise people's sense of risk and of death. And so they're trying to shape how these people see the world more. Trying to shape them to give them a worldview that allows for them to market easier. And so the Ping An is very well adapted to Chinese culture because in using guaqi and requiem, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but so it talks about Yang Fa, if I said that right as well, and it's pre-existing relationship method to prospect clients. And so a guaqi network is kind of like, it's like a kinship network. It's a network of interpersonal relationships. And Renqing is the idea of reciprocity. And so Ping An, they hire a lot of people. They don't go for this standardized professional approach and try and shape how people view the world. They're using these guanxi networks and manipulating the idea of Renqing for these people to buy life insurance. They're using these people not for their skills but for their networks of people. And it talks about this idea of a sea of people approach, which Mao used in the Korean War. And it's just the strategy of overwhelming Americans, or just overwhelming professionals, I guess, with just ordinary folk. And so these guanxi networks is the same thing. They're just sending these people out with little training and just trusting in the guanxi and the requiem networks. Which solves, guanxi networks and the etiquette of requiem activated cultural schemas of intimate relationships and a sense of trust and obligation to solve. So this solves need and the sense of trust, which is something the PA did very well. And then lastly, this book gets into a concept called marketing the self. And this I thought was very interesting and culturally specific. So it's just basically how these economic actors utilize cultural toolkits to make sales. It's the way the book calls it is the social convention of reciprocity employed by sales agents to induce conformity. So the American example it gives to this is an American salesman who is creating a friendly environment and the kind of obligation that you have to reciprocate that with them, they use to their advantage in America. So the Chinese version of that is called effective investment, and this, according to the book, is the best way to be likable. So effective investment is cultivating relational bonds and eliciting indebted feelings and empathies, and is a strategy anchored in principle of reciprocity. So it's using these guanxi networks in a way to stimulate Renqing reciprocity. So the way these people do this is they sell themselves as helpful friends, as filial daughters-in-law, knowledgeable salesman, one even a naive little sister. So they sell themselves as Kim, basically. And yeah. So that's basically the gist of the book. I really liked the cultural toolkit approach, and I thought this was probably the most practical of the books we read because it just talks about how to talks about the different strategies these groups did in terms of adapting to cultural schemas and inventing entirely new cultural schemas in marketing. And I thought that was really interesting. So, yeah. Thank you. See you.